Well, Kim, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be back with you, Ravi.
Well, okay, let's start with JD Vance, who appeared on the Daily over the weekend and was asked about the results of the prior election. Let's go to this clip.
In the debate, you were asked to clarify if you believe Trump lost the 2020 election. Do you believe he lost the 2020 election?
I think that Donald Trump and I have both raised a number of issues with the 2020 election, but we're focused on the future. I think there's an obsession here with focusing on 2020. I'm much more worried about what happened after 2020, which is a wide open border, groceries that are unaffordable. And look,
Senator,
Lulu,
yes or no?
okay,
Did Donald Trump lose the 2020 election?
let me ask you a question. Is it okay that big technology companies censored the Hunter Biden laptop story, which independent analysis have said cost Donald Trump millions of votes?
Senator Vance, I'm going to ask you again. Did Donald Trump lose the 2020 election?
Did big technology companies censor a story that independent studies have suggested would have cost Trump millions of votes? I think
Senator
that's the
Vance,
question.
I'm going to ask you again. Did Donald Trump lose the 2020
And I've answered
election?
your question with another question. You answer my question and I'll answer yours.
I have asked this question repeatedly. It is something that is very important for the American people to know. There is no proof, legal or otherwise, that Donald Trump did not lose the 2020 election.
You're repeating a slogan rather than engaging with what I'm saying, which is that when our own technology firms engage in industrial scale censorship, by the way, backed up by the federal government, in a way that independent studies suggest affect the votes, I'm worried about Americans who feel like there were problems in 2020. I'm not worried about this slogan that people throw. Well, every court case went this way. I'm talking about something very discrete, a problem of censorship in this country that I do think affected things in 2020, and more importantly, that led to Kamala Harris's governance, which has screwed this country up in a big way.
Kim, I think you get the picture here. There are a couple layers of this that you're uniquely poised to help us understand. Number one is the claim that they're only focused on the future, right? And I think you just wrote this amazing book about the pardon power. From my estimation, not only is Trump continuing to talk about how the election was rigged and in ways very different than the Hunter Biden story, which we could talk about, but they leveled multiple lawsuits related to things totally different than the theory that Vance is espousing. But he's also promised repeatedly, Trump, to pardon people involved in January 6th, which would seem to be, the opposite of being forward-looking and thinking towards the future. So very loaded question for you, but help us unpack that particular part of this claim that Vance is making.
Well, I must say, I agree with JD Vance, or I'll accept the critique that some of us have a, quote, obsession with January 6, 2021, which was a violent attempt to overthrow the peaceful transfer of power from one administration to the duly elected winner of the 2020 election, and that is Joe Biden. And that here we are, all these years later, Donald Trump's the nominee, and we are days away from a very close election in which reporting is manifold that there are multiple attempts to set things up again, to have a contested election, to challenge legitimate votes. And I just did a column this week in the Bulwark, having read the 165-page brief filed by Jack Smith in that case about around the question of immunity. And I'll tell you, Ravi, what jumped out at me, reading this again in a new voice, right? Jack Smith's lawyer's voice, how the big lie was decided before the election. It was strategized and planted before the election. We will not accept the votes, the outcome by the voters. So I don't, to say, oh, well, those people are obsessed with the past. Yeah, to your point, the past is really serious, and it foretells, unfortunately, the future. And they're clinging to the past as part of Donald Trump's platform for reelection, which is grievance, which is, if you follow me, it is our turn to right the ship. The last election was stolen, and we're not going to allow this one to be stolen again. So it's extraordinarily dangerous. And on the pardon power, this is probably also the first time in American history that a major nominee has run on the promise of pardoning, quote, patriots who engaged in a bloody insurrection that led to deaths and multiple dozens and dozens of injuries, serious injuries of our law enforcement. And over the summer, there was a poll done. A majority of Americans, including Republicans, don't want those folks pardoned. Why? Because they don't want green lighting of violence around elections. Americans understand that is extremely problematic. And so there's just a lot about JD Vance's, that clip, that's problematic. I'll say one other thing, which is his mansplaining and sort of intolerant and patronizing tone that he has with female reporters. He did it with Lourdes Garcia Navarro there. And he also did it with my former colleagues at CBS, Nora O'Donnell and Margaret Brennan, to suggest that the question is somehow not a legitimate question. And I take offense to that, listening to that exchange.
And, I was critical of the suppression of the Hunter Biden story, but there's no universe that we live in which the numbers that Vance is claiming who are affected by that story or the non-story are anywhere in the universe that he's talking about. So the actual data that he's talking about is a poll that was given that, he neglected to mention that the data set that he's talking about, he's extrapolating from the people who responded were limited to the people who were following closely the Hunter Biden story, right? So he's saying, there's this, overwhelming amount of people whose votes were changed. So first of all, the amount of people who are closely following the Hunter Biden story is a group of people that's heavily skewed towards people who are following right-wing media, New York Post, Fox News, other more right-wing sources. But let's pretend for a second that he's right, that some amazing amount of people were somehow affected by the non-reporting of the Hunter Biden story. It's a rather strange timing because just this week we got basically a replay of the equivalent of this, which is that the New York Times reported, and I'll quote from the story in a lengthy story about Elon Musk, quote, after reporters' publication of hacked Trump campaign information last month, the campaign connected with X to prevent circulation of links to the material on the platform, according to two people with knowledge of the events. X eventually blocked links to the material and suspended the reporter's account. So, Kim, please help me understand, and again, I was critical of the suppression of the Hunter Biden story. We've played this Hunter Biden story out now. I beg anybody to explain to me what the real story was there that would have been that relevant to that election. But tell me how this is different. Like, how is Elon Musk suppressing the hacked materials on behalf of Trump any different than what people are accusing X and liberal media of doing around the 2020 election?
Well, Elon Musk controls Twitter, or controls X now. He has an extraordinary amount of power. He's close to Donald Trump. He's pouring money into the campaign. And if reporting is correct, we don't know for sure. This is done in part with the expectation that he'll have a tremendous amount of power and authority in the next Trump administration. He's reportedly poised to be the first trillionaire on the planet. Someone with money edging his way into dominating American politics. It's an oligarch. It's not a voter, so to speak. So that's apples and oranges, number one. Number two, to the extent to which, as you point out, I've tried to unpack what is the there about the Hunter Biden laptop, but assuming there is something that's problematic there, that somehow would have swayed voters in that election, I would assume the voters of interest would be swing voters who were on the fence but went for Joe Biden, or people that were committed to Joe Biden, but if they had known of whatever was on Hunter Biden's laptop, they might have flipped their votes then to Donald Trump or not voted at all. It's such a slim speculation that it would have any impact on those voters. My guess is in that election, Joe Biden voters were going to vote for Joe Biden over Donald Trump, notwithstanding what would have been on that laptop, particularly after the 4 years of chaos and destruction to democracy that they witnessed. But also, I think that story suggests somehow, back to the original question of JD Vance, that Biden did win the election, right? And that these votes would have made an impact and somehow helped Donald Trump. So it's a bit contradictory and cynical to somehow JD Vance to say, on the one hand, I'm not going to admit that Biden won, but by the way, if this information had been public, he wouldn't have won. None of that makes sense. And my last point, I should say, if what JD Vance is suggesting is we need to have a serious conversation about disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, and distortions through lack of access or over access on online platforms, let's do that. Let's bring it on. I think that affects every American in a disproportionately negative way, particularly our youth. And I know that as a mother of teenagers, that it's corrosive and problematic. But my guess is people like Elon Musk don't want to have that conversation. They would not want to see fair regulation to ensure the American people get accurate information about elections moving forward.
Yeah, what's interesting is Elon Musk has now reinstated Ken Klippenstein's account over the weekend in response to this story. But again, like what you have here is a rerun of the exact same thing. And interestingly, the liberal media, Ken Klippenstein notwithstanding, did largely stay consistent with what they did last time, which was what they viewed with the Hunter Biden laptop. Again, I don't agree with this decision, but viewed it as illegally procured, stolen material, didn't report on it close to the election. They did the exact same thing. Most media outlets refused to report on information that I guess would have been inconvenient to Trump. I think it was as inconsequential ultimately what Ken Klippenstein wound up reporting than the Hunter Biden laptop story would have been. And again, to our listeners, and I know I get a lot of questions about Hunter Biden. We've had so many debates and discussions about this. We can go back and talk about all the grandiose promises that have been made that we're going to, Hunter Biden was going to, land at the doorstep of Joe Biden, and that Joe Biden was going to be caught on the take, and that there are all these promises about what that story is going to mean. None of it played out, right? And there were also some really heinous detours where there was, foreign interference. If you remember the gentleman named Smirnov, who was supposed to be the star witness for the Republicans, it's all led to nothing. Obviously Hunter Biden has questions to answer for, but at no point has it led to any impropriety from Joe Biden that would have been material to an election. And you know what, mysteriously, Kim, what we never hear about anymore is the investigation into Hunter Biden. And I suspect it has something to do with the fact that Joe Biden is not at the top of the ticket anymore.
Well, the other thing, and all of that, I agree with everything you just said, but also it's a bracing thing to realize that while Joe Biden was president of the United States, and under Joe Biden's attorney general and under Joe Biden's Justice Department, he's the top person in the executive branch. His son was indicted by federal prosecutors and convicted of federal crimes. That is the antithesis of sort of a finger on the scale of justice that he had the power in theory at any point have shut that down. He said he will not pardon Hunter Biden. We will see. He hasn't had a lot of pardons. We will probably see a flurry of them at the end. I have been on record. I did a column for The Hill. I think a pardon of Hunter Biden would not be just sheer nepotism based on the facts of those particular cases. But the fact that Joe Biden stood by while his son went through that process, that he had the authority to stop, even if it would have been politically inexpedient, and he didn't do it, to me is the testament to why Joe Biden is not the despot that I think people sniff him out to be without any evidence, as you suggest.
Yeah, and for the record, on my part, I think he should not pardon Hunter Biden, and I'll criticize it if that were to come. I take him at his word at the moment that he won't, and obviously we'll tackle that if anything changes on that. On this Elon Musk story, before we go off of it, I'm confused. So Musk is running a political action committee, and he's spending a ton of time with Trump and seems to be communicating directly with Trump. Back when I was running campaigns, you couldn't go near people who were running political action committees. How is this not a violation of federal election law?
Well, I haven't done a deep dive into that particular issue, but as you indicate, right? I mean, the reason we have so much money in elections is because of Citizens United, which essentially held that corporations are the equivalent of humans for purposes of First Amendment rights. That they're the corporation, which is a clique. It's a theory. It's a legal concept on LegalZoom. It doesn't even have a brick and mortar building. It doesn't have a social security number or birth certificate. Has First Amendment rights, and because of that, money in politics has channeled towards ads. But to your point, the law is really clear. You cannot coordinate with a candidate. You cannot communicate with the candidate. That becomes something that the Federal Election Commission regulates, and that could give rise to civil and criminal liability. That being said, the FEC is what's called an independent organization and independent agency. It does not have a single person in charge, and it is configured to have equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans that have to vote together to agree to take action. And historically, that political makeup has just kneecapped their ability or willingness to actually take any action against the big fish. If there's action, it's against the lower hanging fruit. It doesn't really make an impact. That has to change. But the only way to change the configuration of the Federal Election Commission would be for the United States Congress to pass a law amending the Federal Election Commission Act, which, politicians probably like the idea maybe that they don't have a lot of cops on the block. At the end of the day, Ravi, law is not so much about what it says, but about whether it's enforced. I live in Maryland, and a speed camera was just installed on a very busy thoroughfare. People are now slowing down. The speed limit hasn't changed. It's just that enforcement of the speed limit has changed, which then gives life to the law. And the election laws just aren't really enforced.
Yeah, what's fascinating is, Musk gave this interview with Tucker Carlson, where at the beginning of it, he was giggling and talking about how, if Harris wins, I'm screwed and they're going to lock me up and all this kind of stuff. And he's basically accusing her of politically motivated, preemptively accusing her of politically motivated prosecution while he's violating the laws. So he's basically saying, if you come after me, it's only because of your political bias, not because I'm actually violating the law in plain sight, right?
Well, and also there is that 60-day internal memo by DOJ where instigating investigations or criminal prosecutions, instigating them, not pursuing them, but starting them within 60 days is frowned upon so as not to influence the election. And, your comment makes me think Elon Musk and his lawyers must be aware of that, blatant violations of the election laws now are not going to be touched for no other reason other than DOJ has promised not to do it.
Well, and does the deal, you talked about and this is probably going down a huge rabbit hole, but you talked about how the Federal Elections Commission has that makeup. What's the interplay between what the Federal Elections Commission does and what the DOJ does in relation to violations of election law?
Yeah, so the FEC has, I believe, some enforcement authority. There are two mechanisms for enforcing laws. One would be in a civil way where there be fines, and the FEC can issue fines. And as we all know, particularly when you're talking about, big corporations or gajillion billionaires like Elon Musk, a fine for you and me could deter behavior. The same fine is not going to have an impact for someone with a lot of money. It's a drop in the bucket. So, people with a lot of money might speed a lot in their Ferraris and just collect the tickets and collect the parking tickets because they can pay for it. They'd rather speed and park in the handicapped parking spot than have to worry about these low-level fines that for them don't make an impact. So even though the FEC has that authority, the fines aren't necessarily going to have an impact. Then there's a question of criminal liability. The Justice Department would, and there was that prosecutorial arm would be the entity, no doubt in connection with the FEC's lawyers, but would actually bring a criminal prosecution, different kind of aspect of the law, and that could only produce the difference. Not only, but the difference in criminal and civil is it can produce a criminal fine, but it also can produce jail time, so long as there's a human. If you're actually criminally prosecuting a corporation, like we saw with the Trump organization in New York, you can't put the corporation in prison. So then you're left to fine. So there's a lot of moving parts there, and politics, I'm sure, also behind the scenes, Ravi, in terms of the appetite for moving these things forward. I think after the Trump years, even federal law enforcement and prosecutors are chilled from taking actions for fear of retaliation to themselves.
Well, I want to eventually get to some of the state level election law in some of the swing states that you've written about. But before we get there, let's close the book on this Vance clip. and I think this is related to some work that you've done around the January 6th case with Jack Smith. But remind us one more time here. Vance is talking about the Hunter Biden laptop as if that was the theory of the case that Trump's team was putting forward to say that the election was rigged, right? Remind us, and the January 6th case, I think, gets to some of this, what they were actually saying back then. Like, I'm sure they were talking about the Hunter Biden stuff here and there. But if my memory serves me correct, there was a pretty extensive list of accusations that Trump threw out and that his lawyers tried to make about fraudulent votes, yada, 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 yada. That actually gets to a little bit about what the January 6th case is about.
Yeah, no, it wasn't about Hunter Biden, as far as I can recall. And there were 60 plus lawsuits filed at state and federal level. And all of them, with the exception of one tiny portion of something in Pennsylvania, were tossed out by judges, including Trump appointed judges, because courts don't have discretion to entertain garbage lawsuits. You can file the garbage, and someone has to dismiss it and get it off the docket. And I think the theory that in 2020 was, in terms of public opinion, if you file a lawsuit, that's the smoke and there must be fire. But as you know, I teach first-year law students. I've done it for many years. You can file anything. You can file a lawsuit against someone for stink eye on the metro. That doesn't mean you'll get any money. There's no such claim as stink eye on the metro. You might have your feelings hurt, but you can't go to court and get a judgment for stink eye on the metro. But someone still has to get rid of the case. It's going to sit on the judge's docket. It's going to look like there's something there until someone files a brief, tells the judge there's no such thing as stink eye in the metro, and it gets thrown away. So the 60 plus cases were essentially stink eye in the metro. What were they challenging? One big one, for example, Ken Paxton, Attorney General out of Texas, tried to sue the state of Pennsylvania to get the courts to throw out votes in Pennsylvania. There's no claim for one state to reach into someone else's state and say, throw out your voters' votes. That doesn't exist, right? So a lot of those things got tossed out. But I think the playbook, Ravi, I'm glad you asked this question, is going to be the same. We were talking a lot about, okay, the polls, how far ahead or behind is Kamala Harris versus Trump? Who's going to win? I don't think that's really the question. The question is, how well are these games going to be played this round? What are the games? The games, number one, keep people from the polls. How do you do that? And we're seeing it already. You pass new laws making it harder to vote. You instigate challenges to voter eligibility that just make it very hard for those people to get their votes counted. You amass armies of citizen overseers to lean over the shoulders of voters at the polls. We're going to see this, intimidating them, potentially making them feel uncomfortable to actually show up. You actually also try to get these folks to lean over the shoulders of the ballot counters. That's going to happen. Suggesting that somehow our friends and neighbors that engage in polls and elections are a bunch of fraudsters. That was never been the case. The only actual tinkering with voting machines happened in Georgia on behalf of Donald Trump. And we know that because we had a guilty plea in Georgia. So that's the actual fraud. The fraud was for the Republicans the last round. So you keep people from the polls, you keep them from voting.
By the way, Kim, I can't help but mention, please tell me what would have happened if that guilty plea came from a Democrat? Like if that were the anecdote to come out of the election? It's amazing how few Americans even know what you just said. It's in part because there's a tremendous double standard here.
I think the answer would be, yeah, but, and I was on C-SPAN a week or two ago and talking to callers. Yeah, but there's 2 million illegals that got to vote. It's very hard to answer something that's a lie that someone believes. So
Right.
Even if that information got out, I don't know if people would believe it. But to answer your question, I think it would be the entire Trump campaign. It would be every speech. It'd be every interview of JD Vance. It'd be every ad. The Democrats tinkered with an actual machine in Coffee County, Georgia. And we also saw in another state, a woman who engaged in election fraud on behalf of Donald Trump, who was an election official, was sentenced to 7 years in prison. So the election fraud the last round, at least by the court's count, happened on behalf of Donald Trump. They haven't been able to dig anything up meaningful that was done on behalf of the Democrats. But just to finish my sort of run through of what the issues are: keeping people from the polls, making it hard to vote on an election day, and then we're going to see lawsuits challenging the counting of the ballots. And then I think the next phase would be, if there's enough chaos, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, in January, trying to create some chaos around counting of the electoral votes, claiming that there was insufficient evidence of certification in swing states such that we need to have a contested election, which could then potentially, under the 12th Amendment, go to the House of Representatives, which is now controlled by the Republicans. So there's many stages of cheating Donald Trump's way into office that really don't have a lot to do with the legitimacy of the ballots counted.
Well, okay, let's go to the states then. You just wrote a fascinating article where you went through 3 states, Georgia, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, to talk about the state of changes to those election laws. Let's start with Georgia. What do we know that today? What's different about Georgia's election law and or environment, right? You talk about, like, sometimes it's not just a change to the election law, but change to who's in what position of note. So walk us through what's going on in Georgia.
So Georgia has an election board that has passed a series of new regulations. And I say regulations, that this is not in this statute. This is not passed by the Georgia legislature, which I think some election law experts believe is a reason to not worry about this. I disagree with that. But essentially, one of them is to require hand counting, I think, on the day of the election, of every single ballot that is counted by machines. So these already overworked election workers, many of whom have left the profession since 2020, many of whom are, under severe threats of violence for having actually just even participating in this process, they're now going to have to hand count the ballots. Election officials, experts believe there's actually more chance of errors through hand counting. And I think it has to be 3 different people that simultaneously hand count all of these.
How long is that going to take?
Right. How long is that going to take? And, they're going to be bleary-eyed and tired after all this work. How is that making it safer and more likely to produce an accurate outcome than a machine? That's number one. There are also 2 other Republican-backed rules in Georgia. One that allows county-level election officials to conduct a, quote, reasonable inquiry into the results before certifying them. And the other is to, quote, examine all election-related documentation created during the conduct of the elections. So what does that mean? It means whatever garbage is on the internet, whatever claims of, dead people voting or suitcases full of fake ballots or whatever. Now county level, basically bean counters, historically, their job is to count the ballots, not to question the validity of the ballots. Now we've got multiple mechanisms for these people, if they want to see Trump win, to find fraud in otherwise legitimate ballots. And we will have to hope that the courts shut them down under Georgia statutory law, and that the certification happens on time, and that the certification includes the ballots that they're challenging, right?
So, okay, help me understand. So is there a chance that there's only a machine count, or are we guaranteed this hand count that these folks are asking for?
All of those 3 rules that I just mentioned are currently under litigation. Plaintiffs have sued the election board, saying you don't have the authority to pass these 3 rules in advance of this election. And it's possible that there'll be an injunction and they will be lifted prior to November 5th.
Well, let me just paint a picture for the audience here of what this is going to look like if these things are in place. Remember how long it took last time for Georgia, Arizona, and some of these states to come through, right? And remember what happened in between that space. This is the space at which Trump was kicking up all this dust around the election, conspiracy theories, etc. But now, if these rules go through, what do we have? We have a potentially even longer timeline, more subjectivity in there, and many, many more fires that the legal establishment, press, et cetera, are going to have to put out. And all this is going to lead to more instigation of his base. Trump has shown he is willing to lie to his people over and over and over again. Even the most ardent Trump supporters now in the Senate, many of them, including people like Dan Crenshaw in the House or JD Vance in the Senate, had some pretty pointed things to say about Trump's lies around the election and what led to January 6th. You're going to get those things on steroids here.
I think that's the plan, right? I mean, as I said, I read the Jack Smith immunity brief and I was like, whoa, it didn't occur. I forgot that this was the big lie wasn't just something that was born on November 5th. They planned to do this. Steve
Right.
Bannon announced in advance they weren't
Right.
going to they're going to announce that he won and that the election was fraudulent. So yeah, we're seeing that. The point is chaos, delay, confusion, as much as it is canceling votes and strong arming a win for Donald Trump. The chaos is the point.
Right. And actually, let me fact check myself. I have no idea if Vance actually at that point was speaking the truth. I forget at which point he stopped criticizing Trump. So I could be wrong about that. But insert Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, whoever, like insert any number of these people. Were very clear at that point about how destructive Trump's lies were. And I think people are papering over it under this theory that the past is the past. But I think what should be obvious at this point is that past around January 6th, important to address in its own right and have accountability for. But one of the reasons why we're still talking about it is because this has become a cause of Donald Trump that he is both implementing into law and practice around this election, but also has become a central messaging point for him. Like this grievance around the election being stolen. He's saying the exact same things, if not more significantly, more forcefully this time around than he did heading into the last election. And now he's got more cover locally and in local laws and regulations to help.
Well, one of the pillars of democracy and what distinguishes a democracy from a fake democracy and authoritarian regime is trust in institutions. That in order to have a functioning democracy, people have to believe in the legitimacy and the validity of the institutions. So whether Donald Trump, even if Donald Trump doesn't wind up in office in January, the corrosion of the democracy is already in place. And that's really the bigger problem. And that's a problem that affects Republicans as well as Democrats and their children, frankly. I mean, if anyone's listening and might say, okay, well, I get this, Kim Whaley's biased and, she doesn't understand all the problems and there was fraud at this state and that state. I've had conversations with these folks. It's the system itself that we need to protect. If you've got a child that is too young to vote, that child has no agency in this moment to protect the bigger project of democracy for themselves and to enjoy the benefits of liberty that come with a democracy, and that requires trust in institutions. So it's the attacking the institutions fraudulently, regardless of the outcome of this election, that is, frankly, honestly, more troubling to me.
Well, let's talk about Michigan. How is Michigan different today than it was during the last election?
Well, Michigan has actually put some things in place that are bright spots in this kind of canvas of darkness that we've been talking about. And they were put in place by a citizens initiative in 2022. That is, it was a ballot measure, and the actual people of Michigan voted to make it significantly easier for voters to have their ballots counted. They expanded access to mail voting. They expanded access to early in-person voting. They're allowing weekend voting for the first time. They're allowing more time for election officials to process and tabulate ballots, not less time that this hand counting in Georgia appears to be doing. They've also voted to authorize voters to use additional types of voter ID, whereas in other states, there's efforts by the GOP to not allow students, for example, to use their student ID to vote when, like in Texas, for example, you can use your gun registration, but not your student ID. Voters who cannot show physical ID are able to vote if they sign an affidavit at the actual ballot box, and they can opt into being a permanent vote by mail person. That's the case in other states, so you don't have to re-register every year. All of those mini hurdles, those micro hurdles, ultimately operate to keep people from the ballot box. And I just think that's anti-democratic. We should have the people picking our leaders and not the other way around.
Yeah, and one point of clarification for people who might be confused about your point about more time versus less time to count the votes. I vaguely remember around last time there were changes to laws to prevent voting officials from counting early vote ballots before and absentee ballots before election day. Is that what you're referring to? Like more time to count votes?
No, I guess I meant to back up. What I meant is that won't be so under the gun to do so many things in such a short period of
I
time.
see what
That's
you're
what I
saying.
meant.
Okay.
Actually, the one thing in Michigan, there were additional days for actual counting ballots due to COVID. That did not pass. So actually, in Michigan, there's been more time to tabulate, but they won't have those extra days that they had due to COVID. And as you know, it really varies state by state. But I want to just put a footnote on this. And this Congress could again pass laws that impact federal elections across the country. The reason you go to get your license, your driver's license, and you can register to vote at that time, first, register pursuant to that state's registration laws, is because Congress passed that law. Congress could pass a law making Saturday voting day. Congress could pass a law allowing vote by mail for federal elections. If people want to see all this drama stop, I think the way to do it is to get Congress to pass more federal laws to just make it easier for everybody.
Well, one more state. Let's talk about like the big kahuna here, Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania, since 2020, the law changed to automatically register every qualified Pennsylvania resident who gets a new or renewed driver's license or ID. They are automatically registered at the DMV unless they specifically opt out. But mail-in ballots have to be received by November 5th, unlike having additional days to actually count the ballots due to COVID, which was one of the big fights in 2020 in the state of Pennsylvania.
And one thing that's interesting to me as I listen to this is that the changes you make, one could make a case that it could help Trump more. Like the fact that you're expanding the electorate potentially in Michigan and Pennsylvania, that's Trump's theory. The Democratic Party is the party, I'll put Georgia aside because that's going to be selective shenanigans, right? Like the challenges to ballots aren't going to be system wide. They're going to go after votes that they think are Democratic, right? I'll put that aside. But Pennsylvania and Michigan, making it easier to vote, registering certain people automatically, getting people ballots at home. The Democratic Party is increasingly the party of the more highly educated, higher turnout, which is why they overperformed, among other things, in midterm elections over the past few cycles. Expanding the electorate or making it easier for low propensity voters to vote, that could help Trump. Like, so when people are hearing these conspiracies, I'm like, isn't that your theory? Like, your theory is to bring these younger male voters who have not voted a lot in the past into the electorate. Everything you just mentioned will make it easier to do that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, but it doesn't, it's at the price potentially of the narrative that our institutions can't be trusted, right? So it's the distrust, I think, that might be the primary objective. Democrats tend to vote by mail more. I think the numbers are already that way, that the early voting is more Democratic than it is Republican. But to your point, there was a story a few weeks ago out of Arizona about how there were some technical requirements under Arizona law that might not have been adhered to in the last election. And some of the conversations amongst the Arizona election sort of people in charge, members, about what to do about it was the concern that if they addressed it, it would actually be disenfranchising Republicans. So the broader point, I think, is extremely well taken, which is that access to the ballot helps everybody. Everybody have agency, and if your vote didn't matter, there wouldn't be so many efforts to make it harder to vote.
Yeah, got it. Well, okay. The pardon power. Let's end with returning to your book. Well timed. What do we expect from Trump as it relates to the pardon power? We talked about the January 6th. Like, we can guarantee, he said it, he's promised it, that he's going to pardon the cadre of January 6th defendants. Has he been clear about exactly who and for what crimes?
He said that he would pardon the ones that are innocent. But of course,
Okay.
I mean, the way we determine that is our criminal justice system. And in this moment, they've either pled guilty or they've been convicted by jury. So they're not innocent, at least the way we test innocence. So I think that's not clear.
Okay. So we have that issue. And then you have Trump himself, who is facing charges for January 6th, among other things. Obviously, he can't pardon himself in the New York case. So we'll put that aside and whatever is left of the Georgia case. But remind me, can he pardon himself?
Well, this is like my speed limit point. It's if he does, who's going to stop him? No, it'd be unprecedented. But I don't know that there's a mechanism in place to undo the pardon. I know most people assume he did not pocket pardon himself the last round. I'm not so sure because he did dangle his belief that he had the authority to do that. And I don't think.
What's a pocket pardon?
A pocket pardon, it's my friend Glenn Kirshner on MSNBC. He sort of coined it, meaning a self-pardon, in the top drawer of Mar-a-Lago. He hasn't needed to use it because the Supreme Court has been so helpful so far.
Wait, hold on. So there's a theory out there that Donald Trump, before leaving office, wrote himself a pardon, but none of us have seen it yet.
Yeah, that's a theory, sure. I mean, when he was in office, he was asked if he could self-pardon, and he said he believes he can. And maybe he just didn't get around to it, but it's not, to me, just following the logic of what he said himself and the fact there's no law forbidding it. It's like an insurance policy. Some say, well, if he had done that, he would have brought it up already. He would not have waited this long. He would have raised it the minute Jack Smith indicted him in Florida and DC. But I don't know. He got a great judge in Florida, and he's raised a lot of money off of these indictments. So he doesn't want to go to jail for sure. And so this is maybe the last bid to have protected himself. But I should just say, because of the court's immunity decision, Ravi, I think the self-pardon is irrelevant moving forward. It's not the question anymore. The only president who might benefit anymore from a self-pardon would be Donald Trump in his last term, because now the court has said you don't need anything to pardon because you can't be criminally indicted at the federal level anyway.
But to be clear, in Jack Smith's estimation, he can be prosecuted for activities that fall outside of official acts as president. And obviously, the Supreme Court had a pretty broad definition of what an official act is or a related act. But Jack Smith's theory is that a lot of this electioneering work that he was doing fell outside of his official role. And it seems like there's at least a path there.
Yes.
And if he were prosecuted on that, he would either have to self-pardon him, or if that prosecution continues, he would either have to self-pardon, or probably even easier, it's just fire Jack Smith, right? Like put somebody in charge of the Justice Department who can get rid of any of the prosecutors and drop the cases. That would seem easier than a self-pardon.
Yeah, let me unpack that. What I was saying was a future president probably won't be dumb enough to walk that line. They will commit their crimes using official power. And if they do that, they won't need to self-pardon because they'll be immune from any prosecution. There's nothing to pardon because there would never be a prosecution because the Supreme Court just manufactured immunity for crimes using official power.
Yeah, and can I explain how that could work, right?
Yeah.
Let's say I am an unscrupulous president and I just lost an election, right? And I want to steal the election, right? I want to take it back, and I want to have a meeting with my lawyers about this. One thing you could do, at least from my reading of the Supreme Court case, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is instead of just having a private call with my election attorneys or whatever, I could bring in my White House counsel. I could bring in, domestic policy advisor, and I could say, look, we've got a problem in our elections. This is a nationwide problem that as president, I need to solve, right? Not for me personally, but we just need to solve this problem because voters are getting disenfranchised, and that's our job, as president of the United States. So let's, insert fake electors, insert all that. Tell me, am I wrong that would stand the scrutiny of the Roberts decision, the Supreme Court decision, that is an official act now because I've now couched it as part of my official role?
Right. I mean, I think you and I are saying the same thing, right? No, a president, put another way, will be smart enough to know how to couch it in a way to have it insulated from any criminal scrutiny. And you could throw in the Federal Election Commission Act, the Federal Election Commission, which is an executive branch agency. You could talk about your oath to defend the Constitution, which includes the right to vote, whatever you want to do. You can put all that in there, right? And make sure it's done in the Oval Office with your advisors around there, around you. And then not only can it not be prosecuted, but a lot of that conversation would probably even be immune from scrutiny for purposes of an indictment, because the court said the official act cannot be part of the case.
So again, he could fire anybody he wants in the Justice Department, get the case dropped, and he could pardon himself.
Yeah, so he could. I mean, there's a theory running around based on a federal rule of criminal procedure that he couldn't just fire Jack Smith, that he would need to get Tanya Chutkan, the judge, to authorize that, to agree to that. I don't know what the other alternative for her would be, if she could somehow direct the appointment of an independent prosecutor. I mean, that would require a lot of chutzpah on the part of a federal judge. But yeah, or he could just keep it and just tell them to do nothing, go home and, tend to their roses in the backyard and just not do anything.
Them being the Jack Smith team?
Yeah, or he could replace them with his loyalists and then direct them to do nothing,
right,
rather than shut down the entire thing.
Oh, I see.
Officially.
Well, I don't know where to end this apocalyptic conversation, Kim, but let's talk about where can folks find your book?
Oh, it's everywhere. It's on, Amazon. It's on my website, kimwehle.com. You can follow me at Kim Wehle, Wehle, on Twitter and on Instagram. And we'll keep having these conversations. I do want to
give us the title, by the way, so folks can.
Thank you. It's called Pardon Power: How the Pardon System Works and Why. And it's packed with all kinds of stories. Again, my friend Glenn Kirshner says it reads like a spy novel. Maybe he's exaggerating. He's quite a persuasive person, but it's for everybody. And it talks about really what this election's all about, Ravi, which is what kind of government do we want? Do we want a democracy? Do we want an unlimited dictatorship, or a king where they get to do what they want to do? That's a really important conversation to have, and everyone should think about that before they go to vote. And I would encourage people to vote.
Well, Kim, thank you so much.
Always great to talk to you. Thank you.